In this video, we are going to break down how one staged train ride locked an entire country into decades of segregation. It was 1896 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Homer Plessy, 1/8 black, 7/8 white, committed a crime under Louisiana law. His offence? Sitting in the wrong section of the train in the year 1892. Minutes later, police dragged him out. What looked like a routine arrest was actually something bigger. Activists staged Plessy's ride on purpose. Their mission was clear: take segregation to the Supreme Court, expose it as unconstitutional, and end Jim Crow before it could spread. But instead of stopping segregation, the court handed down one of the most disastrous decisions in American history. After the Civil War, formerly enslaved people gained rights at a speed that terrified white politicians. Black Americans voted, won elections, and built schools. For a moment, the South looked like it might actually embrace equality. But when Reconstruction ended, the backlash came fast. States passed Jim Crow laws designed to separate black and white citizens in every possible way. Schools, buses, theatres, even cemeteries. Louisiana's version was the Separate Car Act. One train car for whites, another for blacks. On paper, it claimed to be equal. In reality, it was about keeping black Americans second class. That's when the Citizens Committee in New Orleans made a daring play. They picked Homer Plessy, a man light-skinned enough to highlight how absurd these laws really were. If he could be arrested for being black, then surely the courts would see how unfair segregation really was. Plessy bought a first-class ticket, got arrested, and his case shot straight to the Supreme Court. This was the moment the court could strike down segregation before it became a national standard. Instead, it gave segregation the full backing of federal law. The Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in favour of segregation. Only one justice dissented, John Marshall Harlan. He wrote that the Constitution should be colourblind, but his voice was drowned out by a court that decided segregation wasn't discrimination, as long as the black facilities technically existed. The ruling unleashed a tidal wave. States raced to pass more Jim Crow laws, confident they'd hold up in court. And they did. They held up for decades. The separate but equal fallacy was legal. But the equal part was an absolute lie. Schools for black children got pennies compared to white schools. Facilities built for African Americans were filthy, and public services for black communities barely existed. This wasn't equality, it was legalised humiliation, and it was enforced not just by law, but by culture, violence, and fear. And this legal stamp of approval didn't just shape the South, it gave cover to discrimination everywhere in America. But the story doesn't end in 1896. For almost 60 years, Plessy was the law of the land. Entire generations grew up under this system. It wasn't until 1954, with Brown versus Board of Education, that the Supreme Court finally admitted Plessy was wrong. By then, the damage was generational. The wealth gap, the education gap, the housing gap, they all trace back in part to the single 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. But imagine for a second if Plessy had gone the other way. If the court had correctly ruled that segregation violated the Constitution, America could have taken a completely different path. Public schools might have been integrated from the start of the 20th century. That means black children and white children learning side by side, not in 1970 after endless battles, but in 1900, 2 entire generations earlier. The political world would look different too. Black politicians who gained office during Reconstruction might have kept their seats, inspiring more to follow. Instead of being squeezed out by Jim Crow, black voters could have remained a powerful bloc from the 1890s onward, shaping national elections long before the Civil Rights Act. Even cities and neighbourhoods would look unrecognisable. Imagine no redlining, no segregated housing markets carving out black and white districts. Wealth and home ownership opportunities could have flowed across racial lines a century ago. The wealth gap that plagues America today might not even exist. The jazz clubs of New Orleans, the Harlem Renaissance, the birth of hip-hop. These movements still would have thrived, but without being labelled as separate or other. They would have been woven into the mainstream earlier, reshaping American identity decades before they actually did. Of course, racism wouldn't have disappeared. Prejudice doesn't vanish with one court case. But the legal foundation that allowed it to harden into law, that could have been shattered in 1896. Instead, the court chose fear over fairness, and the nation has lived with the consequences for generations. Plessy versus Ferguson is more than a court case. It's a symbol of how one decision can warp the trajectory of an entire country. It began with a man on a train and ended with half a century of separate but equal lies. It showed how fragile justice can be, but it also showed that bad decisions aren't final. They can be overturned, they can be resisted, and they can be undone, even if it takes generations to do it. Our nation has come a long way since 1896, but there is no doubt we still have a long way to go. If we learn from our mistakes and don't allow fear to guide us or our differences to divide us, we can all prosper together.